Thank you for joining us for The Power of Telling Your Story. I'm Andy King with AmeriCorps Vista in Washington, D.C. Our production team today includes Joanne Lau and Bethany DeSoblin at Education Northwest. They've helped to prepare today's webinar, and they'll be managing the technology. You'll also find all of us in the chat and the Q&A to help address your questions. Before we jump into the presentation, let's look at the objectives for this session. We hope that by the end of the webinar, you'll be able to, first of all, define the key elements of a well-structured story, that you'll be able to describe your AmeriCorps Vista service in a concise and compelling way, and that you'll be able to adapt your Vista story to different audiences as well as to different delivery methods. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the presenters for this session. With over 10 years experience in a variety of fields, from community economic development to diversity and inclusion to public affairs management, Allie Snell heads up the Office of Marketing Outreach and Recruitment for AmeriCorps Vista. Allie has overseen a complete refresh of all the print and digital recruitment materials. She's developed training resources and produced multiple national recruitment ads and events. Allie herself is a Vista alumna as well as a returned Peace Corps volunteer. Later on, we'll be joined by our multimedia specialist, Matt Payne. So to get us started, let me turn things over to Allie Snell. Allie?
Thanks, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here. As marketing professionals, we know that ultimately marketing is about effective storytelling. The ability to tell your Vista story goes way beyond what you might think of in terms of marketing. So what do we mean by story? Well, when we talk about stories, the power of your narrative can be harnessed for a variety of uses. Whether you are angling for a new job, pitching donors for the seed money to help your project flourish, or recruiting new volunteers, your success in these endeavors depends on your ability to craft a compelling story. Most people don't just come out and ask for things. They convey information in the form of a brief anecdote or story. So even a short 6-word memoir like the ones you just wrote in the chat activity before we got started, those are examples of ways to tell your story. So why would you tell your story? There are many reasons for wanting to tell your story. Telling your story can help spread the word about AmeriCorps Vista and help us recruit the next generation of Vista members. This picture is an example of an advertisement we ran last year for a virtual information session. We had 2 currently serving Vista members attend the session and speak about their experiences, their motivations for joining, and some of the biggest challenges and rewards they encountered in service. It was a really well-received event, and we were able to attract over 2,000 potential applicants who were interested in participating in the webinar. While prospective applicants do want to know the nuts and bolts of how to apply for a Vista project, what really motivates them ultimately to apply are the stories of service that they hear from the people who are doing the work. We also know that the majority of our Vista members learn about the program through alumni stories and testimonials. So that's just one reason as to why telling your story is super important for the program as a whole. So another reason for telling your story, this is an example of a short, quote, story where you might describe what Vista is to a future employer. Here's a quote from a Vista member, and when telling your story, that can help you with a job, whether you're building your resume bullets from your VAD, or preparing your 30-second elevator pitch, or coming up with compelling examples for job interview questions. Being able to reflect upon your service in a storytelling way will help with your career. When asked about your service and motivation, this is a great opportunity for you to include a soundbite. We believe Aaron's example here, as you can see in this quote, helps distinguish Vista as a professional opportunity more than just the traditional hands-on volunteer experience that many employers understand. So why is this important? Well, it is challenging because, with Vista, we have brand recognition nationally, but as Vista members, a lot of you don't necessarily have affiliation directly with Vista so much as with your organization. So, also helping to tell the employer about what makes Vista so unique is going to help distinguish it to future employers and help them to better understand when they see somebody who has AmeriCorps Vista on their resume. So another reason for why you would want to tell your story is it helps you build a professional bio. At some point in your career, you will have to do this, even if it's just a short statement such as this one here from Michaela Lafrac. For those of you who are NPR geeks, like many of us here in the office, we were thrilled to learn that one of our local correspondents counts her VISTA experience as relevant enough in her career to make mention of it in her short bio. The fact that she identifies specifically with VISTA as opposed to with her partner organization speaks volumes. And it goes back to the point that I just previously made. The more folks know about AmeriCorps Vista as a national program that you can be affiliated with, the better it is to help you tell your story to future potential employers. So I'll give you a couple examples of I guess I'll give you an example of why telling the VISTA story is a challenge even for us here who work in the business of telling the AmeriCorps Vista story. So last year, we redid our entire website and just recently created all new marketing materials for the AmeriCorps Vista program. In the process of refreshing our print and digital properties, we had to seriously rethink about how we told the VISTA story. How were we to succinctly capture the unique and diverse programming of AmeriCorps Vista in a compelling way to attract new volunteers? Well, we did a lot of soul searching, a bit of market research, and hours upon hours of editing. And we ultimately went back to the basics, to our very legislation that defined the early days of AmeriCorps Vista in the 1960s, and reassessed how we messaged ourselves in a modern era. This blurb on the slide is part of our new branding and messaging language, which we feel accurately tells the VISTA story in a way that's understandable to a general audience without using a lot of internal language. I say all this because for you to start crafting your own VISTA story, you might have to go through a similar process like what we did here. Now, hopefully it won't take you a year like it did us. Eventually, all of our work in building out the narrative and context of the VISTA program led us to be able to craft short and succinct social media posts about the impact of our program. But we didn't arrive at this graphic that you see here overnight. Before we were able to come up with the short sound bites, we had to focus on the larger story we had to tell with AmeriCorps Vista. So, of course, the biggest difference between the process we undertook and the one regarding your story is all about the framing. It's much easier to talk about a single individual or narrative rather than a diverse program that spans over 50 years of history with nearly 8,000 volunteers participating annually. We had to distill AmeriCorps Vista down to its essence and make very broad generalizations. But in crafting your story, you can focus on one specific person, event, or scenario that can serve as the overall example of your service experience. We will talk about how to break down a compelling narrative in the next couple of slides. And I just want to pause for a second, and I'm glad folks are asking questions. Someone asked if that graphic that I just showed is available to promote your program. Absolutely, and at the end of this session, we can point you to where all of these graphics and cool things are located. So, yes. So, why start with a long story? When you focus on we're going to start with, helping you craft sort of your longish, I would say 3 to 5 minute narrated story. And why do we want to start there? Well, when you have a longer story, you can if you have that nailed, you can really break it down into the smaller components for multiple uses. Kind of like the example I just gave you when we talked about the AmeriCorps Vista story. In learning how to craft your much longer story, you're setting yourself up to break it down into usable smaller parts. Just like when you bake a pie, the effort you use to bake a whole pie gives you a whole big thing, just like the effort you took to create your larger story. But ultimately, you can break the pie down into smaller pieces to suit your needs and ultimately to share with others. Okay, so the elements of a compelling story. Let's start with this graphic breaks down the ability to, the elements of a compelling story. And really, the ability to tell compelling service stories starts with an engaging plot. These are the elements of an engaging plot. The first is the context. When and where is the story taking place? It's important to establish context. The second is action. What happens in the story? Or what happened in the story if you're telling it in the past tense? And of course, the third piece, tension. Raise the stakes. Think about where the tension is and how you can build the tension in your story. And of course, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. If you're recalling a previous event that was a challenge for you, don't be afraid to just call that out. Number 4 is change. It's not really a story unless something fundamentally changes. The change might be internal, like a shift in perspective, or it might be very obvious, like the creation of something new. And then finally, closure. Did you deliver on your promise after setting up a central question? Now, have you ever listened to somebody tell a story that goes on and on and on? Well, that's a failure to deliver closure. Or maybe you've heard someone tell a story and you just couldn't understand what they were getting at. That was a failure to develop really good context or to follow through with any of the 5 steps. So these 5 elements of a compelling story and creating a compelling plot are really essential and really all need to be included in order for you to have a complete picture. So it's a lot to digest, but let's go to the next slide. I'm going to give you a story from StoryCorps and a story on, now we're going to hear a story from StoryCorps, and this is an example of a story from, if you guys haven't listened to StoryCorps before, it's a great resource and we'll note it. But this is a great example of a short, just about 2-minute story from a man named Anthony Planakis, who is a 4th-generation beekeeper. So let's take a listen.
When you're going through the academy, they put out this little card and they ask you on this, hey, whatever you're interested in, just put it down over there. Beekeeping, of course, I put that down. And the very first job, the sergeant comes right up to me and I just look up and I go, hey, Sarge. And he goes, bees? And I go, yeah, where? Oh. And I go, cool. That was it. That was the first job I handled. Whenever I'm working a swarm, I hear nothing around me. I mean, you can have a jackhammer running down below. I wouldn't even hear it. I'm in the perfect world then. Actually, that's the only time I feel safe. I'm never scared, never afraid. So I think it's in my blood. My father was taught the art of beekeeping by my grandfather, but growing up, I wanted nothing to do with them. Then 1977, springtime, my father looked at me and he goes, grab that chair, sit in front of the hive. I looked at him and I go, you're crazy. I'm not sitting in front over there. And he goes, just sit there. I want you to see what's going to happen. The sun was just coming up over the hill. Dawn was just breaking. Lo and behold, as soon as that sun hit that hive, they started flying out. Let me tell you, that was the alarm clock going off. And it was gorgeous. It was beautiful. And he goes, they know what to do. They have to work. And that's their job, to work until they die. And, I mean, that's what I do. I don't go on vacations. I see it as a waste of time because I'd rather work with them. And I look at them as my children, which I don't have any children, but I look at them as I took it upon myself to say, hey, you know, I'm adopting, 27,000 kids right here, so I better be looking out for them. So I've learned from the bees patience, respect, and I guess work till you die.
Awesome. Okay, so I know that it's hard to sometimes hear through the really thick New York accent, but hopefully you guys were able to also read along the little slide cards that gave the transcription of the story. But hopefully when you were watching that story, you noticed some of the 5 elements that we just learned in the short piece. So I'm going to just go over a couple of the things that I picked up. And then we're going to see another video, and hopefully you'll have a chance to sort of keep your eyes out for the ones that you see. So the context that we heard from the beekeeper was provided in a really subtle way. He mentions the academy and the sergeant, but we're not sure what type of unit he's with or where until he says the word Harlem. So even though it was very vague, he still quietly framed the story in the first few sentences. The tension and change come in the experience he had when his father asked him to sit down in front of a hive just as the sun was coming up. But how about closure? Did you notice how he shifted from the specifics to a broader view? He talks about what he learned from the bees and how he applies it in his life. Another trick that he pulls that is a really good successful technique in great storytelling is that he bookended a phrase that he heard at the end of his story. And it was the direct quote from his father saying, "They work until they die." And he bookended his entire narrative with, "Well, I just work until I die." So those are just a few of the elements of successful storytelling that we saw. So moving along, we're going to hear from another story from StoryCorps. And again, if you guys aren't familiar with StoryCorps, we're going to share where to find all these great stories. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of stories. It's an amazing resource where this program goes around the country and records people's lives and their stories that they have to tell. And this time, now that we're going to listen to a different story, I want you to listen carefully to hear how the different elements, context, action, tension, change, and closure, are built into the story. After we listen to the story, you'll have a chance to share your ideas. And okay, let's listen.
I was 15 years of age when I first started having my own private sit-ins. I guess I got tired of looking at signs that said whites only, so I would go into the 5 and dime store, sit at the whites only lunch counter, and whenever the police came, I skirted out of the back door. My family had no idea. The only way they found out was from the newspapers. You know, like a reporter calls home, "Do you know your son's in jail?" And my parents became very proud of me, but they wished it would have been somebody else's child. I've done some crazy things, but you take chances when you're young. I call it youthful exuberance. I can remember having to sit in at the lunch counter in Arlington, Virginia, and word spread throughout the neighborhood, and that's when they started gathering around this child. I'd say he was about 12, 13 years old. He took his finger and pointed to me like, "Get out, you know you aren't wanted here." I could only hope that as he got older, some of his attitudes regarding equality and equal rights changed. The last time I was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I was their guest on more than one occasion. So the white guards told these inmates, "We got a troublemaker here, gang. If you give him a hard time, you may get time off for good behavior." I think that was the time I was most frightened. Except a couple of the guys in there, they knew somehow who I was. And they told the guys, "Don't mess with him." That was my salvation. Today, when people read my name, they may not know who I am, and most likely they won't. I have 3 grandkids. They aren't the least bit interested. But anytime I pick up a historical publication, I feel as if a period or a comma in that book is my contribution.
All right, so that was Dion Diamond's story, and he was, as you know, a key figure in the civil rights movement, and just also an unsung hero. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy, who's going to lead us through a little discussion from what you just saw.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. And now it's your turn. We want to hear from you using the chat panel on the right side of the screen. So in the story that we just listened to, which of the storytelling elements, the context, action, tension, change, or closure, which of those elements were evident to you? So in the chat, ask that you list an element that you noticed and then a really short description of how you saw it included in that story. So the element, but then, you know, how was that represented? If you don't see the chat on the right, remember, go up to the upper menu at the top right of the screen, click the little speech bubble icon, and the chat will open up. All right, so we've got some of you posting already. A couple of you mentioned tension. Obviously, there's tension in here, and particularly Joshua noted when the prison guards were threatening him. that definitely raised attention because, of course, we had no idea what was going to happen. Lindsay noted, too, that he was really vulnerable in explaining how scared he was by that situation. A few others of you have noted closure, and a few of you noted the same very thing, about the punctuation, where he says, reading a history book, maybe I'm a period or a comma in that book. So that was kind of a nice way to close. Wow, you guys are great. They're all coming.
You guys are so fast. I'm reading all this. I saw one that I really liked. Someone mentioned his context. He was really, he rushed right in, right? He said, I started doing my own sit-ins, and you all knew what that meant. I mean, for the most part, I mean, it helped that there was a picture to go with it, but he didn't have to say, it was 1960-something, and I was here. He just ran right in, but it fit in so well, so excellent catch.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I saw the change in attitude of the first person. The second person spoke of tension during the civil rights movement and the action he took with the protests. Yes. Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, there's a number of you talked about change. You know, the change that occurred in the story is when a couple of inmates in the jail stood up for him, and it sort of turned the tide in his favor, among others. So that was a really pivotal part of the story. Somebody mentioned, I don't see it now, but sort of the heartstrings get pulled. Like when I was listening to that piece of it, it's like, oh my gosh, it's so touching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially given that he was so young and did this all on his own. Yeah, I see that people mention I saw a great comment. Someone mentioned I think it was the lighter tension, which was the confrontation with the 13-year-old boy, and then the heavy tension, which was the threats that he received upon being incarcerated in Louisiana. So he had two really very clear examples of tension, and you got there thinking like, oh my gosh, what happened to him? Excellent. You guys did a great analysis. Yep, and he had a great metaphor with being a contribution to history with the punctuation. Excellent. Excellent. So safe to say this was a very well-crafted story in about 2.5 minutes, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say so, and from the looks of the audience, it sounds like yes.
Yeah. So hopefully you had a chance to see two really, I think, very good examples of how to tell a very complete story in not a lot of time. And after you're done with today's webinar, we do record these, so you can always go back, re-listen, and just get a sense of, now you know the building blocks, the elements of a compelling plot and story, and you've seen some great examples. So let's just go back to the next slide. We'll keep moving right along. So I'll just reiterate again, you've seen the 5 elements in these 2 examples. Now you have your building blocks, you have your framework. So I'm going to just move on and see how we can take this basic framework and build it out into a rich and memorable account by also taking a few more storytelling tips and tricks. And think back to the 2 videos we just saw, because you might have caught some of these little tips, okay? All right. So the first, we learned about the major elements, and here are some of the big tips. We'll go through a couple slides. First point, no more than 3 characters. People won't remember in your story any more than 3 named characters in the story. For example, in Dion's example, he didn't actually name any of the other characters, but he referenced 2 other characters and himself. Perfect, right? He referenced the young boy, and he referenced, the inmates in prison as sort of his own character, and then I guess you could say the police were the 3rd. And he references his parents, but absolutely no more than 3 named characters. As we said earlier, be vulnerable. You're trusting the audience with information about yourself, so remain humble, but be personal and intimate. I think both of those examples gave us a really good insight to the vulnerability people share with stories, and that draws your listeners in. Another one, and you saw this in both stories, is include dialogue in your story. That helps develop the characters, and it makes it memorable. So when our beekeeper, has a direct quote from his father, you remember that because he repeats that quote at the end of the story, and that really frames the whole narrative. And then that leads me to the fourth point here, which is find a way to frame your story. Find the context of why you are telling the story. The why is really essential. It relates to what your story is really about. You should always you should always find a way to bookend your first and last piece of the story to satisfy your listener. And so in both cases, you saw a great job framing, and it didn't have to be, today I will tell you a story, and they all lived happily ever after at the end. Obviously, there's a lot more subtle ways to do that. So again, these are just a couple of great tips. And we'll continue on to the remaining 4 tips. Just like with the no more than 3 named characters, there is something in writing as well as in oral storytelling, which is the rule of 3. And this principle suggests that things that come in 3s are inherently funnier, more satisfying, or more effective than other numbered groups. So an example of this, and I actually use this a lot, we talk about this in resume writing, to where it's like, I oversaw the management and implementation of a major project, like 3 things, doing these 3 things. So it's always the rule of 3s, like we went boating on a sunny day with my aunt, my cousin, and my mother, or telling a story in 3 parts. So the rule of 3s kind of cycles throughout. And then have perspective on your story. One of my friends who is actually a professional storyteller and who gave me a lot of the tips that you see in this presentation will always say there's no crying in storytelling. If the story is still too close to you, it's not ready for an audience. So you have to, even though it might be something that you're recalling that's very painful, very scary, very emotional, just keep in mind if you can't cry, if it's too real, then it's not ready to be shared. Avoid jargon. This is something I added. Between the word VISTA, between your organization and your position, the potential for acronym use is very high. Using a lot of acronyms, or really using any acronyms, will confuse or bore your audience. Keep it simple and just keep it from one perspective. So you're going to tell the story, tell it from your own perspective, or tell it from the perspective of a person you worked with, or you could tell it from the perspective of one viewpoint. But avoid the jargon. And then finally, keep it short, keep it simple. For your longest, most heartfelt story, keep it to less than 5 minutes. Ideally, as you saw from those 2 stories, I think keeping it under 3 minutes or between 3 and 2 minutes is the best thing. For other storytelling purposes, you want to take this we'll say 3 to 5 minute story and cut it down to much smaller chunks. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. Okay, so we've talked about all these things, and we've talked about some of the stuff. I've given you guys a little bit of a hint. But let's look at Dion's story again, and this time keep an eye out for any of the storytelling tips that we just learned. And then we're going to have a chance to talk about it. So we're going to roll Dion's story one more time.
I was 15 years of age when I first started having my own private sit-ins. I guess I got tired of looking at signs that said whites only, so I would go into the 5 and dime store, sit at the whites only lunch counter, and whenever the police came, I skirted out of the back door. My family had no idea. The only way they found out was from the newspapers. Like a reporter calls home, do you know your son's in jail? And my parents became very proud of me, but they wished it would have been somebody else's child. I've done some crazy things, but you take chances when you're young. I call it youthful exuberance. I can remember having a sit-in at the lunch counter in Arlington, Virginia. Word spread throughout the neighborhood, and that's when they started gathering around this child. I'd say he was about 12, 13 years old. He took his finger and pointed to me like, get out, you aren't wanted here. I could only hope that as he got older, some of his attitudes regarding equality and equal rights changed. The last time I was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I was their guest on more than one occasion. So the guards, the white guards, told these inmates, "We got a troublemaker here, gang. If you give him a hard time, you may get time off for good behavior." I think that was the time I was most frightened. Except a couple of the guys in there, they knew somehow who I was. And they told the guys, "Don't mess with him." That was my salvation. Today, when people read my name, they may not know who I am, and most likely they won't. I have 3 grandkids. They aren't the least bit interested. But anytime I pick up a historical publication, I feel as if a period or a comma in that book is my contribution.
All right, so now that we've seen Deion's story again, we have a chance for you to apply what you just learned, this time in terms of the tips, the 8 storytelling tips that Allie shared, and you see them there on the screen. And I think Amber sort of beat me to it at this. Use the chat now to tell us which of the storytelling tips that you noticed in there, and again, just a short little description of how you saw it included in the story. All right, so some of you are really quick at typing. So we've got the rule of 3s in there. He talked about 3 different experiences. Several of you mentioned that. The vulnerability, and that shows up in a number of ways. He talks about being scared. He talks about how young he was, and you know, he makes it really immediate as he's describing what he was facing. Memorable dialogue, a few of you mentioned that, and one of you pointed out where he talks about youthful exuberance, and he sort of pauses before he says that, so you get that, you know that something's coming, and that makes it more memorable. Another example of dialogue was the period or a comma in terms of civil rights history.
You guys are really sharp. Obviously, you're all storytelling experts because you're picking up on all the things. And again, I love this story because it's so well crafted. He makes himself very vulnerable, and it was a very emotional story to tell, I can only imagine, and yet he was able to take very heavy subject matter and make it relevant and compelling and scary, but then insert some humor when he talks about his grandkids, as you guys pointed it out. And he kept it short. He managed to convey, and I saw a lot of the rule of 3s. I saw 3 examples of optimism. I love that. You guys, the 3, you know, he used the 3 examples of his different experiences, and he still managed to wrap it all up. And, you know, you got a very clear slice of a time in history and of the impact of one young man, and it all was done in 2.5 minutes. So, yes, you guys are doing great. You guys, you get it. You now are experts in being able to see not just the elements of a good story, but a lot of the really great tips for making it not just a good story, but an excellent story. All right. Let's move on. Okay, so we've given you the elements of a good story and shown some compelling examples. Now, your question's probably like, okay, where do I start? The easiest way to frame your story is to start with a prompt, or I actually like to start with a question. Maybe your story starts with a conversation you had with your family when you said, I'm going to apply to AmeriCorps Vista. And maybe that was a great conversation, maybe that was a not-so-great conversation, or maybe their response was, what's that? Maybe your story starts with one memorable day you had, whether that was good or bad. Or maybe the question was, what motivated you to serve in AmeriCorps Vista in the first place? Like Deion's story, you could also start with a conflict and then illustrate your reaction and how you reacted to it. You know, Deion didn't have to start, he just launched right in. He said, I was tired of the whites-only sitting areas, so I started my own sit-ins. That's one sentence, and that set the whole context, and you buckled in for a really good story. You know, there are many ways to frame the story, but if you're really stumped with where to start, I always say start by asking yourself some good questions. And, you know, one other just tip, in the end, don't be afraid to promote yourself. A lot of VISTAs I know are humble people, and it's not about you, it's about the work you do, and I get that, I'm totally with you, but in telling your story, it's about your story. So you're promoting yourself, and just remember, no one else will. These are your words. You have the power to keep the narrative for yourself. Okay. So, do you remember, if you go back to our chat at the very beginning of the webinar before we actually started, we asked you to write about your service experience in no more than 6 words. That was to get you into the habit of thinking about all the important themes, or what I like to call seeds of a story seeds. As you begin to draft your service story, which you would probably write before it becomes an oral story, you will most likely start with an anecdote or a lesson learned as the focus of your story. As we mentioned before, keeping your story to under 5 minutes speaking time is ideal, and honestly, I would suggest keeping it to under 2 or 3 minutes if you can. So this little diagram just kind of gives you a sense of how many, you'll always start by writing it out, right? Because that's just going to help you to, organize your thoughts before you ever go. And even professional storytellers, they spend a lot of time writing out their stories before they actually learn to tell them. The average person speaks about 125 to 150 words per minute. So I would say a 5-minute story translates to roughly 500 to 650 words. But again, ideally, you really want to keep it to like 350 words or less if you want to keep it a shorter story. In terms of length, this slide also breaks down the average word length for just different uses of your story as a guide. So the average blog post or online article that you'd see in like the Huffington Post can average anywhere from 250 to 800 words on the very long end. Same with op-eds that you see printed in a newspaper or digitally. And then we've talked about a 30-second elevator pitch. This is a very common thing that hopefully many of you know what that is about. But, 30-second elevator pitch is, in any case, whether you're trying to pitch for a new job or pitch a donor for, possible funds for your project, it's 30 seconds and you're supposed to put the whole ask in there. That's 70 words, okay? So that's less than a tweet in some cases. Excuse me, that's more than a tweet, but that's 70 words. It's not much. Couple sentences. And then, of course, resume bullet point. You, at some point, when you're finishing your VISTA service, you're going to want to look back at your year of service and say, how the heck do I put this into a series of resume bullet points? Well, I can tell you the average, and we've done a bit of research on this, the average resume bullet point is no more than 25 words, and that's on the long end. So, again, think about all of this as you have to learn to just, we go back to our pie analogy. Your 5-minute or 3-minute service story is your giant pie, and then here are the different pieces that you want to cut off for different uses. So not all people will want to start with a story told out loud, but of course it's helpful to keep the rules of verbal storytelling in mind as you adapt your story for other uses. And honing your verbal storytelling skills will also give you the ability to more carefully edit and curate your story for other media such as writing, video, and digital, which leads us along to another voice in the conversation.
Thanks, Allie, for that great foundation for storytelling. Now let's bring another voice into the conversation here. Matt Payne is the multimedia specialist for AmeriCorps Vista. Prior to joining the staff at Vista, Matt spent 2 years at NCCC headquarters, taking on a variety of marketing projects, including developing new recruitment and outreach materials, and in redesigning the website. Matt began his career as a graphic designer in Southern California, and he served 2 terms an AmeriCorps NCCC member with the Southern Campus. Matt, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Andy. Glad to be here. Hey, everybody. All right, so I'm going to talk to you today about how, with this information, how you're going to get your story out into the world, some of the platforms that you can utilize, as well as some tools and tricks to make it a little bit easier on yourself. So here in the Vista Marketing Unit, we truly strive to promote the Vista experience through the words of our members and alums. because the VISTA program is as varied and diverse as the people serving, we know the best way to communicate the program is through the stories and lived experiences of you all. One of the best ways that you can share your story is online through blogs and platforms such as Tumblr, Medium, and WordPress. It's a great place to showcase short stories, longer form stories, pictures, et cetera, to really capture your experience and share it with the digital world. So what we have here is an example of a Tumblr blog that we found of a VISTA member that had a variety of content on it. They would share just motivational quotes throughout the year that really inspired them or related to their work. They would write short stories and vignettes of their service, and by creating a blog and putting your stories in one place, you're really going to be able to share them on a variety of other platforms just to both elevate your story personally and professionally, but as what we're focused on too is inspiring more people to join the mission of VISTA and of fighting poverty. Just one thing to keep in mind as you're working on your blogs is that you do, as VISTA members, have to put a disclaimer that just says that the views and opinions of that you share are not representative of CNCS or AmeriCorps VISTA. Of course, as a member, you're still, the Hatch Act still applies to you, which I'm sure you all learned about during PSO. But yeah, again, a blog is a great place to start. All right, so professional. This is a really, really important piece. A lot of us who did VISTA and finished service are how can you really showcase the skills that you learned through VISTA and highlight yourself in the best way possible. So some of the new platforms that are popping up are portfolio sites. So a place that you can really showcase yourself as a professional and take it beyond just like a LinkedIn profile or your resume and cover letter, a place to showcase some of your projects with photos and you know, sample writing, things like that. This is an example of a site actually by former VISTA that we just hired here in DC, Crystalline Dupree. She's our new outreach and recruitment specialist. And she put a resume on it, project samples, multimedia she created, and just gave us insight into who she is and what inspires her personally and professionally. And this really does go a long way. And so there's sites to do this for free. Wix.com, Squarespace is a place to get started, and check it out. See if this could be a good tool for you to help promote some of your professional strengths and your motivations. All right. So you all definitely have a story to tell. We have, and there are opportunities in our digital world to truly gain exposure and viewership for your ideas. One of the ways that you can get your story out is writing a really compelling op-ed style piece about your service or a topic that you care deeply about. I like to consider VISTAs as thought leaders on the issues that you're working on sort of in the trenches every day. You guys know firsthand what poverty is in communities and the challenges that are facing them, and there's no harm in talking about these things and sharing it with the outside world. There are op-ed style community forums on places like BuzzFeed or HuffPost where you can just take time to tell your story and share your opinions, of course always with the disclaimer that your opinions don't represent CNCS or AmeriCorps VISTA. But it's a great way to, again, establish yourself as a thought leader and get this very unique experience that you have out into the world. Make sure it's not something that's forgotten. Make sure the lessons that you're learning don't just disappear as UN service. And of course, social media. So I know you all are all over social media. You're sharing, you know, your day-to-day life on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat. But one of the things we wanted to highlight was how you can sort of elevate that. So, of course, most organizations we all work with have company pages that have, you know, thousands and thousands of followers, of course, more than any of us individually do. unless you're an Instagram star. Shout out if you are. But these are two of the ways you can do that is go to your sponsoring organization and say, hey, you know, I'd love to do a member feature. I'd love to do like a quote graphic with my photo and like a testimonial about my service. Some of your sponsors might already have tapped you for this, but it's a great thing to do just to get the word out. Get featured in your local or in your organization's newsletter. Again, these are going to be things you can point back to on your portfolio sites, just to show that you were engaged and you were sort of lifted up as a leader and as somebody doing something good. So we also have social media platforms here at AmeriCorps Vista that we love to feature you guys on. We have a Snapchat account that we always welcome members to take over. So if you're interested in being featured on sort of the larger AmeriCorps and CNCS platforms, you can do that by reaching out to us. VistaOutreach@cns.gov. We'll give you that email a couple more times before we end, but social media is a great tool to elevate your story. All right, so I mentioned LinkedIn a little bit earlier. So back to the professional piece. It's a great place to connect for potential employment opportunities, but you can also use it to highlight your service in a more in-depth way. This is something we recently discovered that we think is really cool, and LinkedIn has a function that operates sort of like a blog where you can do a long-form story about a professional experience or a service year, and you can actually attach it to your LinkedIn profile. So this is a Vista member we found. His name is Preston Chan. The story is called My Amazing Year with Google Code Core. And he talked about how he actually turned down a job out of college with Apple to join Vista, and his motivations for turning down this awesome job to go do something that he was really passionate about. But he didn't miss the chance to highlight that story and to highlight how Vista truly changed his life, and it's a part of his professional story. And these sort of stories really set you apart. And of course, Preston, after finishing his Vista, I think now it's working at Google. But you know, again, if these are the type of if you have a story to tell about your career and why you chose Vista and where you're going or where you've been, LinkedIn is a great place to highlight that through these blogs. All right. So how are you going to get started? So, of course, the obvious place to start is just keep a journal documenting your experience. It sounds simple, but a lot of us didn't do it during service, and we really wish we would have. Just a written journal. There's also, of course, digital journals that you can log on to and just, I don't know, document moments that were impactful to you. Those simple stories will really come in handy down the road. Job interviews, you know, like I said, crafting cover letters, things like that. You can share an op-ed with your local newspaper regarding your service. A lot of hometowns, especially whether you're staying in your hometown for service or you traveled across the country, we get a lot of hometown newspapers that pick up stories about service members as a way to highlight young people doing great things. So, and there's no shame in you being the one to initiate that by saying, look, here's my story, and it's a great way to share with your community your service. You can connect with your college alumni office to do a feature on your experience in their alumni magazine. Also a great way to get the word out about Vista, but also elevate your story. Or you could start a podcast if that is something that interests you. There's a great example of that that's not here, but it's called This Year and Beyond. A recent AmeriCorps alum has created a really actually well-produced podcast where he's interviewing former service members just to get the word out about service. So that is an option as well. All right, so we're all super busy. Maybe you hate your handwriting. The great news is it's a digital world and there's tons of apps to make your life a little bit easier. Evernote is what I use. It's a great digital catch-all for your notes, for your journals, for your documents, things like that. It's free to use. Highly suggested checking it out if you haven't already. Also, one of my favorites, 1 Second a Day. This is a really cool app that lets you video record 1 second of every day and you can go back at the end of the year and basically watch this 5-minute video of your life over your year 1 second at a time. It's really cool, and people love going back and watching that. That'd be a great thing to share on your social media accounts. There's also an iMovie app on your, if you have an Apple device, you can create video and edit video on your phone, same for Android, so that's an option as well if video is how you prefer to tell stories.
All right, so we've got an opportunity to hear from you all one more time. This time the question is, where will you share your VISTA story? So Matt was showing us a number of different venues and opportunities, and maybe some of those resonated with you. We ask you now to use the chat. Make sure you're sending it to all participants so that everyone can see your contribution. And again, where will you share your VISTA story? So, all right, we've got folks chiming in already with Facebook, LinkedIn, blogs, creating blogs on a number of different platforms there. A number of you are talking about LinkedIn, which I think is becoming more and more popular, particularly in the professional sphere. It's great because it keeps track of everything in one spot. Some of you are still working on it, still thinking about and figuring out where you might be able to tell your story. Let's see. I love the suggestion of an alumni association. And this Tracy, her sponsoring organization, also happens to be her alma mater, so she's got a number of connections there.
Nice. And I saw somebody throw in Pinterest. I never thought about that, but why not? Create great little quotes or sharing motivational quotes or little tidbits of your story or photos from your service is a great thing for Pinterest.
And I looked at someone already spoke to the host of This Year and Beyond. So you're already, we got somebody on the line who's already the master storyteller here. They've been sharing their story. And someone else shared theirs with wrote a piece for their university, their alma mater's political science department. So that's also awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a couple folks mentioned offline stuff like newspapers, looking at their local community newspapers. And then one individual, I think it was Ian, said networking events. So having a story that you can tell face-to-face. How powerful is that? So good job, Ian.
And this is Allie again. I just, something that we actually have suggested as a recruitment technique for AmeriCorps Vista sponsors, but just putting this bug in your all's ear, is the idea of hosting a story slam in your neighborhood, in your community. If you have a number of, VISTA or National Service volunteers in your area, it would be instead of a poetry slam, you can have sort of a story slam where folks get up and tell their 2 to 3 minute stories, just like an open mic night at like a local coffee shop or something like that. I've seen really cool ways to get your story out.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. We're excited for you to get out there and really feel inspired and confident to spread the word about your service. Cool. All right, so last but certainly not least, we want you to share your story with us. Our jobs here at the Vista Marketing Unit is to share your story. And to inspire more people to serve. So one of the ways that we've done that this year is we started this great new quarterly newsletter called the Vista Review. And what it is it's about a 12-page document that highlights some of the most inspirational stories of Vista in the previous quarter. So this really is a platform for you all. So if you have an idea for a story or a reflection, or you want to do a Q&A or something completely different and creative, we are always looking for your content, your photos. You can send those to vistaoutreach@cns.gov, and they'll be included in our editorial meeting where we'll decide what goes in, and that actually includes the Vista director who signs off on those stories. So, of course, not everything you send will get featured, but it's definitely the place to get your content in front of us, and getting featured in a national publication is definitely, again, a great thing to include in your portfolio. So, yep, send us your stories, send us your pictures, and we'd love to feature you.
All right, so we want to make sure we leave you with some takeaways and some next steps, because we hope that you all learned something today, and now you can just take what you learned and run with it. So whether you're just starting your VISTA service or nearing completion, don't wait to document your service as you experience it. Use one of the apps we discussed, or simply just take photos or videos. I was a VISTA over 15 years ago, and I kept a written journal during my VISTA service. And I didn't write in it that often, but I wrote a couple of really memorable periods, and I went back recently to actually check it out, and I had totally forgotten about a lot of the stuff I wrote about. So it was the small details and personal interactions that I was reminded of, and just the individuals that could help me frame my story when I use it in a variety of contexts.
Yep. Another way is practice writing and performing your story. If you're writing an op-ed, it can sometimes be easier to do than crafting a 30-second elevator pitch. Just grab a friend, try practicing with a friend or a colleague to make sure that it sounds natural and engaging. Yeah.
All right, so are you ready to take your show on the road? Something that we're going to be debuting in the next couple of weeks is the VISTA Ambassador Program. And this is an opportunity for our VISTA alums, and so if you're going to be an alumni sometime in the near future, we can send you a free kit of outreach materials and guides on how to tell your story to a general audience and help us recruit the next generation of VISTA members. So this kit will include a presentation deck and story guidelines, and then we encourage you to pick some way to tell your story to a larger audience, like maybe it's your local Girl Scout troop, or you're going to, go back to your alma mater and speak to, one of the undergraduate classes for a little bit. But either way, we definitely want to encourage folks to do that. So keep your eyes out. We'll be sending an email announcement with our ambassador program. And yes, I'm asking you, what is a VISTA Ambassador? It is a soon-to-be program that we will be presenting to all of you, hopefully around AmeriCorps Week, which is in 2 weeks.
Yep. And as I mentioned earlier, send us your content to vistaoutreach@cns.gov or tag us on social media. We use hashtag #IamVista and hashtag AmeriCorpsWorks. So send us your stuff.
Awesome. And last but not least, I have an immediate request. If you guys really liked this session and you feel pumped and you're ready to tell people about your VISTA experience, we are actually hosting a public information webinar on March 6th. That's 2 weeks from today. Excuse me, it's next week, a week from today. And we are looking for maybe 1 or 2 currently serving members who would be willing to Skype in and talk for about 5 to 10 minutes about their current VISTA experience and share a few photos. So if you'd like to talk to potentially hundreds of the general public who are interested in learning about VISTA, please send us an email at vistaoutreach@cns.gov with some information, a little bit about your project, about yourself, and any photos you'd be willing to share. Okay, and before we let you go, we have a couple of great resources to get you started with crafting your stories, as well as links to all the things that we talked about. And Bethany will actually just post all the links in the chat. So we have a great little how to write flash fiction, which is really short stories. We have something on the 6-word story guidelines and sort of where that came from. There's a lot of apocryphal information around where the whole 6-word stories came from. We talk about StoryCorps, so it's storycorps.org. And then Peace Corps, a similar organization to AmeriCorps Vista, they actually do a Return Peace Corps Volunteer Storytelling Contest every year. And the link here actually shows you all of the award-winning videos of the storytelling. And then the VISTA Ambassador Program and other asks that we made, just email us at vistaoutreach@cns.gov for more info, and we'll be sure to get you all that in the near future.
All right, Allie, Matt, thank you so much for all of this incredible information and for telling it all to us in a really compelling way. So I'm motivated now to tell stories, and it looks like some of our participants are as well. Hang on, there's more to come. We're going to get to your questions. But before we do, we want to know what you thought about this session. So the webinar survey evaluation poll has opened on the right side of your screen. 10 simple questions. Use the scroll bar on the right so you can scroll down and see all 10 questions. Once you've done, be sure to click the Submit button so that your answers actually get submitted. We look at all of your comments. I personally read all the comments that people make, particularly if you've got specific feedback about a session, what would have made it better, or if you have ideas for other topics related to this or not that you'd like to see, please let us know. And we're going to then move into the Q&A part of the presentation. So we do want to hear from you. We want to get your questions. And now that the poll has opened on the right, that means the Q&A panel has collapsed. But you can reopen it. It appears just above the poll. You'll see the Q&A there. Click the little triangle next to it and open up the Q&A. That way, send your question in. We'll be able to see it even when everything else is going on. And I'm going to invite our operator, Jill, to come back on the line and tell us how to ask a question by phone. Jill?
Thank you, Mr. King. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone. Please be sure to unmute your line and please record your name when prompted so that I may introduce you to ask your question. Once again, it is *1 at this time.
All right, great. And while we're waiting for questions to come in on the phone, we've got a few that came in online already. And first up, Allie, I'll point this question to you. It was something someone mentioned earlier in the chat. The question was around on your social media, if you're writing a blog or a story somewhere, we mentioned about putting in some disclaimer language that, says that the story represents the individual's view and not that of the program. Allie, do we have some standard language that we could share with members that they could then just paste in or they could adapt for their use?
Yes, we can get that. We're still working with our colleagues in external affairs for some standard boilerplate language, but we can absolutely include that in the session guide once we get that.
Yep, and I would just add, to start off, as simple as these views and opinions expressed here do not represent AmeriCorps Vista or CNCS and are my own. It's just a simple sentence to get you started.
All right, great. Thanks to you both. Another question that came in earlier was around the use of jargon. In the storytelling tips, it was avoid using jargon, and the question was, is VISTA itself, V-I-S-T-A, is that uncommon jargon? In storytelling, should we say it's Volunteers in Service to America? What do you guys think?
I mean, at this point, very few people actually speak the acronym out loud. And we have, as a program, we identify ourselves as AmeriCorps Vista, so I think that's fine. And I recognize it's hard to avoid acronyms when it comes to anything to do with our agency.
Yeah, and we know that you always sort of have to start out talking about your service in that constant struggle of how do I explain what this is? It's like the Peace Corps, it's definitely, it's like the Army, et cetera, and we know that can be difficult, but AmeriCorps Vista is our brand, and so we're just focused on how can we really come to a place where people do know and recognize Vista. So we do need to say Vista and do our best to boil down what AmeriCorps is into a sentence or two.
Terrific. Great, thanks. Next up, we have a question from Mary. She says, I'm a VISTA coordinator for 7 VISTA members, helping them with their job searches, professional development, etc. What do you say to introverts who are less inclined to promote themselves?
Sure. So I would actually suggest, Mary, that, and I think I just typed you a response too, some of the online tools we mentioned, and then I think I did see somebody in the chat earlier mention something precisely to this point. Let me go back to the chat. Somebody referenced a really good thing about precisely what you were saying, so I just want to make sure I capture it. And I'll look for that in a second. Discord. So I think Jorge mentioned a good way to be in touch with others and share stories in a private manner if you're not so much into public forums is called Discord, and that's spelled D-I-S-C-O-R-D, and I'm guessing that's a site, on a platform online. So thank you, Jorge, for that suggestion. And then, Mary, I would say in terms of leveraging creating your stories for professional development, any of the tools that Matt talked about would be great, or just keeping a personal journal. And that's just a way for them to go back and pepper in their resume bullets or their cover letter with just little anecdotes or thoughts. And again, if you ever land a job interview, you always have to talk back to you're going to get questions about how you handled situations in the past. And the more you can give a succinct and detailed response, the better. And Matt, do you want to just add to that?
Yeah, and so I'll add, we know that storytelling doesn't come natural to everyone, and one of the ways that I've seen that can really help introverts is really get creative and speak to your own strengths. I've seen some really incredible examples of members telling their stories in unique ways. For example, like artistry. There was a Vista who was an illustrator, and he put together this incredible illustrated video. There was really an art piece that just kind of went through his service year, and it was animated and it had music. Again, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. So if you have a particular strength, and it doesn't have to be you doing a video recording of yourself if that's not what you're into, or but if writing is your strength or poetry, we've had Vistas do spoken word things, but again, just something that speaks to your strengths could be a good way to get started.
Yeah. And about Vistas and resumes and interviews, I'm seeing folks are asking a question about professional development. Well, our unit here, we're cranking a lot of new tools out this year, one of which is the Be an Ambassador program, which I mentioned it'll be forthcoming in the coming weeks. And another big tool that we're going to release next month is the Life After Vista Guide, which is a detailed guide available to all Vistas on how to translate parts of your VAD, that's your volunteer assignment description, directly to resume bullets. So if folks are like, hey, I really need some help figuring out how to actually write whether it be a resume for a nonprofit job or for a federal job, it's all in there. So we're really excited to release this guide. It's just going through the final stages of review as we speak, and we are just thrilled. So stay tuned for that as well.
Terrific. Let's turn to the phone lines and see if we have any questions there.
We have no questions at this time, sir.
Okay, great. And remember, if you are on the phone line and you want to ask a question verbally, just dial *1. Be sure to take your phone off mute, record your name, and we will get to hear from you. We've got some other questions that have come in here. Belinda, I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly, and apologies if I didn't. But anyway, the question is, in the story we write, if our VAD requires that we reach into the community and to develop relationships with community members, how can I keep the focus on myself only?
That's a really good question. I think you could keep the focus on yourself about it's about you could tell. That's a good question. So I would say, go back to some of those questions and talk about, what was your most challenging day, okay? And maybe your most challenging day was in relationship to the kind of relationship management that you have to do in as a function of your job. Things like that. It's all about framing. I mean, you're the one, you could either position it as you're telling the story, or you could talk about it as if you're talking, I've seen this done really well, and where someone talks about a person in their community. And so they tell the story from the perspective of something that happened to a person in their community, and then talked about the transformation that person undertook and maybe added attention. So you could use a person as sort of the metaphor for, the community work that you're doing.
Great suggestion there. Hopefully that will work for you, Belinda. Let's see, a few other questions. Helen asks, relating to the storytelling tips, she said, can you explain a little bit more about the difference between framing your story and having perspective?
Yes, of course. So framing your story that's a really good question. So framing your story is about you know, how are you setting this up, and how are you making sure that you have all the elements included? And I would say the perspective is really sort of what I just talked about. Are you speaking in first person? Are you speaking in third person? Like, are you telling a story from the past? Are you you know, how are you, is a story like, you know, is the perspective such that, oh, I'm talking about, you know, a thought that I had or a feeling that I had, or are you narrating, you know, an event that occurred? So the perspective is, you know, generally it's keep the perspective consistent with whatever you decide to choose. And I'll use the example of our beekeeper. You know, he was talking about items in the past and this, but really the perspective was, it was about his journey into his career, and it was about him being a fourth-generation beekeeper and sort of how that, you know, fell into his life. So I hope that answered your question.
All right, great. Let's see. Jill, do we have any questions on the phone?
No, sir, we have no questions on the phone.
Okay, great. Let me see. Oh, in the chat there was a little sidebar conversation around on the Vista campus. We've got a number of resources related to social media, and there is a resource there that includes some boilerplate disclaimer language. So that exists, but as Ali mentioned, we're also getting some new input from our colleagues in our Office of External Affairs, because of course social media continue to evolve and expand, and you know, things that we put together even just a couple of years ago might not cover all bases, so we are looking at those online. Also, Ali, you mentioned AmeriCorps Week, and some folks were interested in that, so I'll just take this opportunity to mention AmeriCorps Week is coming up March 11th through the 17th. So it's a full week in which we celebrate, promote, highlight, and sing the praises of all different AmeriCorps programs, including AmeriCorps Vista. So hopefully your sponsoring organization will have some plans already for how they can engage with AmeriCorps Week. And if not, feel free to go to nationalservice.gov, which is our website for the Corporation for National and Community Service. And you'll find more information there about AmeriCorps Week and how your organization can get involved.
Excellent. And Andy, this is Ali. I just want to interject too. And I just typed it in the chat because for whatever reason I can't seem to access the Q&A function right now. But I just wanted to let folks know that people asked about some of the graphics, like the iHeart, you know, 9 Reasons to Love AmeriCorps Vista graphic. Or 8 Reasons to Love AmeriCorps Vista graphic, and all of that and all of our new marketing materials are on our new Outreach Hub webpage, and anyone can access these, and it's nationalservice.gov/Vista Outreach. And I just want to point you all to that, because on there are also a bunch of downloadable and customizable Word templates that are flyers for either marketing your program, but also there's a flyer in there that's a profile of a Vista member or a Vista project, and it's a profile like flyer template. So that's another way. If your organization's like, look, you know, I love the work you're doing, I'd really love for some, you know, to tell that story, you have a built-in resource there. And you can also download all of our photos, our videos, all of our promotional materials. You can order stuff from our warehouse like posters and things like that. So I definitely recommend nationalservice.gov/Vista. And that's a shorthand, but Joanne just sent the complete URL, so thank you, Joanne. And I will again plug, if you're interested in telling your story immediately next week at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, we are giving a webinar to the general public. So if your supervisor is okay with it, with you taking an hour of your time to talk about your experience, please join us, and again, send us a message at vistaoutreach@cns.gov.
All right, great. We have one more question that I see here from Madeline, and this is a personal one. So Ali or Matt, you can decide who wants to take it. It says, can you give an example of one of your own stories and why you became a Vista, or Matt, in your case, why you decided to serve with AmeriCorps NCCC? So either one of you willing to share your personal story?
Sure. All the pressure now.
No pressure.
we've been paying attention to our
Actually,
own content.
we could both share a quick story. Matt, we'll go first.
So absolutely. So I grew up in Southern California and never quite, when I finished high school, I never really knew which direction I was going in terms of my career, or didn't really have a sense of purpose. And when I was in community college, one night I was like complaining to a friend who I was doing a group project with that I was like college is a waste, work is so frustrating. He's like, you should join AmeriCorps. And I was like, what is that? And he had served in AmeriCorps during Hurricane Katrina, and he's like, it's basically the best thing I've ever done. And so I signed up, and it's really where I found my direction. Working for NCCC in New Orleans, rebuilding houses. I was 10 years later, they're still rebuilding from Hurricane Katrina. So that my friend got to work on it during the response, but I was a part of the recovery. And when I got down to that nonprofit, they let me do marketing for their organization, and I found it. I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to spread the word and use marketing to help causes I care about, to get the word out about things that truly matter, not just making a bag of Doritos look really cool or selling you a new brand of toilet paper. Like, marketing is a powerful tool, and storytelling is a powerful tool. So it totally changed my life trajectory. So truly grateful for that experience.
Yeah, so I love that you're putting us on the spot, because it's really hard. So I joined, like a lot of folks who were in college, I realized at the end of my 4 years, I had just spent 4 years focusing on me. And I felt very privileged to have had the opportunity to go to college. It's not something that everyone in my family has had the opportunity to do. And so at the end of my 4 years, I thought, okay, before I go into the working world, I feel like I really need to spend some time giving back, because I just spent a lot of time on myself. And so it was doing some kind of long-term volunteer work was absolutely the next step for me. I just didn't know what. And I was very intimidated by the idea of going into the Peace Corps. I didn't speak a foreign language, and I thought I couldn't hack 2 years overseas. And so someone told me about AmeriCorps, and I learned about VISTA in particular through an internship I had had the summer prior to my VISTA, but prior to graduating. And I became very involved as part of my undergraduate research with a Native American community in northern Wisconsin, and very involved in the activism, very involved in one of the causes that was going on with some of the land use issues. And it sort of opened my eyes to how a whole segment of the U.S. is just dealing with all these different things that are the cause of such bad government policy and neglect, and et cetera. And it really moved me. So when I found that I could apply to serve and focus in on an area that I felt passionate about, it seemed like VISTA was the right choice. Flash forward, I was accepted to serve with the Tribal Project in western New Mexico, helping a chapter of the Navajo Nation with economic development projects. And I'll never forget my first day where I was introduced to my counterpart in the community, and he said, okay, well, you're this, white girl, you've never been here, people don't know you, so you can't just come in here and, start thinking that you're going to get stuff done. He's like, you got to sit and learn and listen and just take your time and be slow. And I thought, okay, of course, I'll take your lead, whatever you say. And he said, well, the first thing you have to do is go to these chapter meetings, which are these weekly sort of local governance meetings, and they can go on for about 6 to 8 hours on a Sunday. And he said, just start coming to chapter meetings, people start to get to know you and start to see you there. Little did I know they're conducted entirely in Navajo. And so I spent probably the first 6 weeks of my VISTA service spending every Sunday sitting in the back of a chapter hall, listening to land use disputes and things like that in entirely Navajo, and just, sitting there and trying to absorb it and listen and be respectful. And, about my 6th week in, I'm sitting there about an hour in, and all of a sudden, the council chairperson stands up and he speaks in English, and he says, oh, and now we're introducing our VISTA volunteer, Allie. Allie, why don't you stand up and tell us a few words about yourself and what you're doing here? We're so excited. And, I mean, like I said, for about 5 weeks, I'd been completely, thinking I was being inconspicuous and in the background and just observing and keeping my mouth shut, and all of a sudden I was being put on the spot in a room full of about 100 people. And from that day forward, that introduction, I think it went over well. And afterwards, my counterpart said, you know, people were really impressed that you came just to listen and learn, and now they're ready to work with you. And now let's talk about getting some business done. And that was perhaps one of the greatest lessons I've ever learned in my professional life, which is you don't have all the answers. You may have the best of intentions, but anytime you're in a new situation, it's always best to observe and to learn and to listen and to always stay humble and know that you're never going to have all the answers and the situation may change, but be a good listener, be a good community person, and be willing to always keep learning. So I know that was probably that was more than 3 minutes, but you guys put us on the spot, so we tried to do what we could.
All right. Well, that was your longer form, right? The whole pie, and you can cut that up in lots of different ways.
Yes.
So that is all the questions that have come in, and again, I want to take this time to thank both Allie Snell, who's the Director of Marketing Outreach and Recruitment for AmeriCorps Vista, as well as Matt Payne, who's a multimedia specialist with AmeriCorps Vista, for all of your insights and sharing so much very useful, practical information. I also want to thank our production team of Bethany and Joanne at Education Northwest for all their support with the online technology, and our operator Jill as well. We really appreciate all of your participation today and invite you to come back in the future for another one of our sessions. In just a few weeks, we're going to be releasing a new learning resource. It's not a webinar, but it's a self-guided tool that you'll be able to use on volunteer recognition. And then our next webinar coming up will be April 24th on running a meeting. Watch your inbox for notice of those 2 learning opportunities. And we look to have you with us again. Thank you all so much.